because, one of our favorite words at user testing is why. We're always, not just curious about what people are doing, but we're trying to understand what's driving their behavior, what we can do better to make the experience better. And a lot of that comes down to really understanding the why behind the behavior. And it seems like this plays a big role in what you're focused on as well. And I think you also say that companies should focus on the why and not just the how or what with onboarding. So can you share a little bit about your perspective there?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a professor of persuasive technology at Stanford called BJ Fogg, and he has this model which defines why people act. Why do they do anything? And maybe it's simple, but he has two axes. One is motivation, and one is ability. So within that chart, there's a line, and that line is, I think, called the trigger line. And so above that line is the space where there's enough motivation and sufficient ability that triggers cause people to act. Below the line means that there isn't sufficient motivation or ability for people to act. And so the takeaway is that for people to do stuff like take actions in your product, there's a combination of motivation and ability. It's not all about how to do something. It's not all about solving for ability. It's also solving for why you should do something. It's solving for motivation. And so you have to solve for motivation. And if you can drive up motivation, you will unlock some of the problems you have in the product around ability or confusing UX. And I give an example of, and maybe this is showing my age, of like the Snapchat early days, where it was a really confusing UX to Snapchat. It was like the navigation was confusing. It wasn't really straightforward, but there was really strong motivation, and so people figured it out. Like, it didn't matter that the UX was confusing. So when teams are thinking about improving onboarding and they're hung up on their UX, I always tell them, like, hey, that's okay. You can fix that, but don't let that stop you, because you can always introduce more motivation. And some of that can just be social proof or promise of reward or case studies, and just simple ways to help people know what is ahead of them if they do a little bit more work. And it also ties into this other trend that we're seeing, which is that marketing is flowing into the product because of, again, usage-based pricing coming full circle here. You have to keep convincing people about the value, and you have to keep showing them value, and they're not going to have all of that figured out before they enter your product. The decision isn't made. They're still evaluating as they're using. And so that marketing has to drip in. And what is marketing? Marketing is all about explaining the value and the benefits of something. And so we encourage our customers, when they're thinking about user onboarding, not just to focus on showing people how to do stuff, but also starting with helping encourage them about why they should be thinking about that, why should they care, and that will also unlock some of the benefits of user onboarding.
Yeah, I love that. And the Snapchat story is interesting in particular. I don't know if you remember, but I can relate with that, because I think I was probably just like a little too old to be adopting Snapchat, and I tried and I couldn't figure out how to do it, and I didn't have enough motivation to figure it out, so I didn't adopt it. But many people did. And then I think it was a year or two into their existence, and people had figured out how to move around the UI, even though it was confusing. They went and redesigned the entire thing. I don't know, did you ever catch this sort of news on the news? So they redesigned it, so people had to go learn a whole new way of using the product, and they saw a whole bunch of like user attrition. Basically, a bunch of people just dropped it. It was sort of like, okay, yeah, maybe we're not ready to learn your second version of really hard to use UI.
And also, no one's goal is to learn how to use software. Like, no one cares. It's just a means to an end, right? And if the end hasn't improved, then doing a redesign, like, you have to show value quickly. And if you don't, then it's just a bunch of work for no reward. So why would they?